Have you ever wondered if a single event could change the course of history forever? Imagine waking up to headlines claiming that American warships had been attacked in international waters. The story spread quickly. The nation demanded action, and within days, the United States found itself moving toward one of the longest and most controversial conflicts in its history. But decades later, historians, government records, and declassified documents would raise a question that still sparks debate today. Did everything happen exactly the way the public was told? This is the story of the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, an event that transformed American foreign policy, reshaped the Vietnam War, and continues to be studied as one of the most significant moments of the Cold War. To understand what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, we first need to travel back to the tense years following the Second World War. The world had become divided into two competing powers. On one side stood the United States and its allies, supporting democratic governments and market economies. On the other stood the Soviet Union and its partners, promoting communist governments across different regions. This global rivalry became known as the Cold War. Although the two superpowers never fought each other directly, they competed through political influence, technology, intelligence operations, and regional conflicts around the world. One of those regions was Vietnam. For many years, Vietnam had been under French colonial rule. After a long struggle for independence, the country was divided into two separate governments in 1954. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, followed a communist system and received support from the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam, backed by the United States and several allies, developed as a separate government with American economic and military assistance. Washington believed that if South Vietnam fell, neighboring countries might also adopt communist governments. This concern became known as the domino theory, a strategy that heavily influenced American foreign policy throughout the 1950s and 1960s. As the years passed, tensions inside Vietnam increased. Armed groups supporting North Vietnam began challenging the South Vietnamese government. The United States gradually expanded its involvement by sending military advisors, intelligence teams, equipment, and financial aid. Although America was not yet officially fighting a full-scale war, its presence in Southeast Asia continued to grow. At the same time, American naval vessels were conducting intelligence patrols in international waters near the North Vietnamese coastline. These missions were designed to monitor military communications, radar activity, and coastal defenses. While the patrols were considered legal by the United States, North Vietnam viewed them as a direct security concern, creating an increasingly tense atmosphere where even a small misunderstanding could have serious consequences. By the summer of 1964, the situation had become extremely sensitive. Every movement of a ship, every radar signal, and every military exercise was closely watched. American destroyers sailed through the Gulf of Tonkin, while North Vietnamese patrol boats operated nearby. Neither side wanted to appear weak, and every encounter carried the possibility of escalation. The stage was now set for an event that would soon dominate newspapers, television broadcasts, and political debates across the United States. The morning of August 2, 1964, began like many others aboard the USS Maddox. The American destroyer was carrying out an intelligence patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, sailing through waters that the United States considered international. On board, the crew monitored radio signals, tracked radar activity, and carefully observed everything happening along the nearby coastline. Although these patrols had become routine, everyone understood that they were operating in a region where tensions were already running high. Just days earlier, South Vietnamese forces had conducted operations against coastal targets in North Vietnam. While the United States maintained that the USS Maddox was not directly involved in those missions, North Vietnamese leaders viewed the growing American naval presence with deep suspicion. As the destroyer continued its course, radar operators detected several fast-moving patrol boats approaching from the north. The distance between the vessels steadily decreased, and every officer on the bridge realized that this encounter could become far more serious than anyone had expected. According to official American reports, the approaching boats continued closing the gap despite repeated warning messages. The captain ordered the crew to remain calm while preparing defensive measures if necessary. Soon, the situation escalated into a brief naval engagement. The USS Maddox fired warning shots as the patrol boats continued their approach. Aircraft launched from the nearby aircraft carrier USS Ticonderoga quickly arrived to support the destroyer. Within minutes, the encounter was over. The American ship reported only minor damage, and no members of its crew were lost. North Vietnam later presented a different interpretation of the event, arguing that the American destroyer had entered waters it considered part of its territory and had created the confrontation through its presence. These conflicting accounts immediately turned the incident into an international political issue. News of the encounter reached Washington within hours, where military leaders, intelligence officials, and President Lyndon B. Johnson began reviewing the reports. Although the engagement had ended quickly, many officials feared it could be the beginning of a much larger crisis. Across the United States, newspapers and television networks reported that an American naval vessel had come under attack. Public attention rapidly focused on the Gulf of Tonkin, and many Americans believed their country had become the target of unprovoked military action. Yet behind closed doors, analysts continued gathering information, comparing radar records, communication logs, and eyewitness reports. Important questions still remained unanswered, and no one knew that an even more controversial event was only 2 days away. What happened on August 4th would become one of the most debated moments in modern American history. 2 days after the first encounter, the Gulf of Tonkin was once again surrounded by uncertainty. On the evening of August 4th, 1964, the USS Maddox had returned to patrol the area, this time accompanied by another American destroyer, the USS Turner Joy. Weather conditions were far different from those of the earlier encounter. Heavy clouds covered the sky, strong winds swept across the sea, and rough waves made it difficult to clearly identify objects on radar. As darkness settled over the Gulf, radar operators and sonar teams began reporting unusual signals. Some crew members believed they were tracking fast-moving patrol boats, while others questioned whether the equipment was simply reacting to rough seas and changing weather conditions. Confusing radio messages started moving between the ships and military command centers. Reports of possible approaching targets were followed by reports expressing uncertainty. The crews remained alert throughout the night, responding to what they believed could be an unfolding situation. Pilots flying overhead searched the area, but struggled to confirm the presence of any opposing vessels in the darkness. As the hours passed, information became increasingly inconsistent. Some messages suggested that multiple contacts had been detected, while others recommended reviewing the reports more carefully before reaching any conclusions. Despite the uncertainty, early communications sent to Washington described the situation as another attack on American naval forces. Those reports quickly reached senior military leaders and President Lyndon B. Johnson. Within a short time, the second reported incident became the center of urgent discussions inside the White House. However, as additional information arrived, questions began to emerge. Several officers involved in the operation later expressed doubts about what had actually happened that night. Radar readings, sonar signals, changing weather conditions, and the stress of operating in darkness may have created misleading observations. In the years that followed, declassified government records, military communications, and historical research revealed that many officials had questioned the accuracy of the second attack almost immediately. Some documents suggested there was not enough evidence to confirm that an actual naval engagement had taken place on August 4th. Historians continue to study these records, and while the first encounter on August 2nd is widely accepted as a real confrontation, the reported second attack remains one of the most debated events in modern American history. Whether it resulted from equipment limitations, weather conditions, confusion during military operations, or a combination of factors, its impact would prove enormous. Decisions made in the following days would dramatically expand American involvement in Vietnam, changing the course of history for millions of people around the world. 2 days after the first encounter, the Gulf of Tonkin was once again surrounded by uncertainty. On the evening of August 4th, 1964, the USS Maddox had returned to patrol the area, this time accompanied by another American destroyer, the USS Turner Joy. Weather conditions were far different from those of the earlier encounter. Heavy clouds covered the sky, strong winds swept across the sea, and rough waves made it difficult to clearly identify objects on radar. As darkness settled over the Gulf, radar operators and sonar teams began reporting unusual signals. Some crew members believed they were tracking fast-moving patrol boats, while others questioned whether the equipment was simply reacting to rough seas and changing weather conditions. Confusing radio messages started moving between the ships and military command centers. Reports of possible approaching targets were followed by reports expressing uncertainty. The crews remained alert throughout the night, responding to what they believed could be an unfolding situation. Pilots flying overhead searched the area but struggled to confirm the presence of any opposing vessels in the darkness. As the hours passed, information became increasingly inconsistent. Some messages suggested that multiple contacts had been detected, while others recommended reviewing the reports more carefully before reaching any conclusions. Despite the uncertainty, early communications sent to Washington described the situation as another attack on American naval forces. Those reports quickly reached senior military leaders and President Lyndon B. Johnson. Within a short time, the second reported incident became the center of urgent discussions inside the White House. However, as additional information arrived, questions began to emerge. Several officers involved in the operation later expressed doubts about what had actually happened that night. Radar readings, sonar signals, changing weather conditions, and the stress of operating in darkness may have created misleading observations. In the days following the reports from the Gulf of Tonkin, events moved with remarkable speed. President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the American people, explaining that the United States would respond to what had been reported as attacks on American naval forces. Soon afterward, the administration asked Congress for broad authority to take military action in Southeast Asia. On August 7, 1964, Congress overwhelmingly approved what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Although it was not a formal declaration of war, the resolution gave the president wide authority to use military force in Vietnam without returning to Congress for additional approval. At the time, many lawmakers believed they were responding to an immediate national security concern. Few realized how significant this decision would become. Over the next several years, American involvement in Vietnam expanded dramatically. What had begun as advisory support gradually developed into one of the largest overseas military operations in American history. Hundreds of thousands of American service members would eventually be deployed. While the conflict deeply affected Vietnam and reshaped public opinion across the United States. As the years passed, journalists, historians, and government investigators revisited the events of August 1964. Newly released documents, recorded conversations, and declassified intelligence reports revealed that many officials had questioned the certainty of the second reported attack, even before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed. These findings led to decades of debate about how governments make decisions during periods of uncertainty and how incomplete information can influence national policy. Today, historians generally agree that the first encounter on August 2nd involved a real naval confrontation, while substantial evidence indicates that the reported events of August 4th were far less certain and may have been misinterpreted because of weather conditions, equipment limitations, and the confusion of nighttime operations. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident remains one of the most important case studies in modern history, not only because it changed the direction of the Vietnam War, but because it reminds us how quickly international events can shape political decisions with consequences lasting for generations. More than 60 years later, students, military analysts, and historians continue to examine every report, every communication, and every decision connected to those 4 extraordinary days. The legacy of the Gulf of Tonkin is not simply about ships in distant waters. It is a lesson about leadership, intelligence, public trust, and the enormous responsibility carried by those who make decisions during moments of global tension. History is often shaped by a single choice, but understanding history requires looking beyond headlines and asking difficult questions. That is why the Gulf of Tonkin incident continues to stand as one of the most fascinating and carefully studied events of the 20th century.